Susan had always trusted Mark, until the day she saw him with Sarah. What started as a quiet betrayal soon spiraled into a devastating secret that would shatter everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and family. As Mark's affair with Sarah unraveled, Susan was forced to face a harsh truth. Her life was never going to be the same again. The Wilson family seemed like any other typical family in their suburban neighborhood. Susan and Mark had been married for over a decade, their lives seemingly picture-perfect. Mark, a successful businessman, had a job that demanded long hours, and Susan, a stay-at-home mum, devoted herself to their two children, Emma and Jake. The couple had built a life together in a home filled with love, laughter, and what appeared to be the foundation of a solid marriage. But as with many things that seem flawless from the outside, there were hidden cracks that began to show, quietly at first, but growing more evident with time. It all started innocently enough. Susan noticed small, seemingly insignificant changes in Mark's behavior. He began staying late at the office more often, telling her it was due to extra work that needed to be done. His responses to her questions became shorter, more distracted, and there was a growing distance between them that Susan couldn't quite explain. Their once easy conversations became awkward and strained, as though a barrier had been placed between them without either of them acknowledging it. Mark's late nights at work became a routine, and Susan, feeling the weight of their deteriorating connection, began to feel the loneliness creep in. She tried to shrug it off, telling herself that he was just stressed, or had simply grown tired of the routine that had become their life. But deep down, Susan knew something was off. It wasn't just his long hours or the empty space between them at night. It was the small gestures that had once been there and had now faded. The way he no longer held her hand on the couch, or the way he stopped asking about her day, it all spoke to a growing distance. The unease in Susan's chest started to build into something heavier, a constant nagging feeling that something was being kept from her. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her overactive imagination. But the doubt lingered. It wasn't until one evening when Susan made a decision that would alter everything. She had planned to surprise Mark by bringing him lunch at the office. It had been a while since they'd had a moment to themselves, and she thought this could be a way to reconnect, to bring back the warmth and closeness they once shared. She picked up the kids from school, made sandwiches, and drove to the office, hoping to catch Mark during a quiet moment. The office was only a short drive away, and she felt a twinge of excitement at the thought of seeing him, of finally addressing the distance between them. But when she arrived, Susan was greeted by an empty parking lot. There were no cars outside the office building except for Mark's, and that struck her as strange. It was only around lunchtime, and he usually had a few meetings in the afternoon. She walked up to the front door, feeling a bit uneasy, but dismissing it as nothing more than a gut feeling. As she approached the entrance, she saw that the door was slightly ajar. She paused, thinking Mark might be in a meeting, but then she heard voices coming from inside the building. Curiosity got the best of her, and she pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw Mark, sitting at his desk, not alone, but with another woman. The woman's face was familiar, Sarah, his business partner's wife. The two of them were laughing, leaning in too close, their body language far more intimate than what Susan was used to seeing between her husband and anyone else. Mark's hand was resting on Sarah's arm, and the way they exchanged glances made it clear there was more to their relationship than just business. Susan froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as a wave of nausea washed over her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. She watched as they shared a moment that was meant for a couple, not two people who were supposed to be friends or colleagues. Mark's eyes sparkled with a warmth Susan hadn't seen in months, maybe even years. It wasn't just a casual gesture. It was affection, something that belonged to a lover, not a business partner. Suddenly, everything she had suspected felt like an undeniable truth. The late nights, the distance, the changes in their relationship, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just a slight shift in their marriage. It was betrayal, plain and simple. Susan stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to tear herself away from the painful sight unfolding before her. The world she thought she knew, the life she had built, had shattered in that one moment. She turned and walked away, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what she had just witnessed. As she left the building, her mind raced with 1,000 questions, but one stood out above the rest. How long had this been going on? And why had Mark chosen to betray her in such a public and hurtful way? What Susan didn't know was that this moment would set off a chain of events that would lead to a tragedy neither she nor her family could ever have predicted. The days after Susan's discovery were a blur of raw emotion and disbelief. Her mind kept replaying the moment she had seen Mark and Sarah together, each time bringing a fresh wave of anger and heartbreak. She couldn't shake the image of them sitting so close, laughing, sharing moments that should have been hers. Every part of her felt betrayed, as though the life she had built with Mark had been a lie. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the realization that everything she had believed in, everything she thought was secure, had unraveled in a matter of seconds. In the days following, Susan struggled to carry on with her usual routine. She dropped the kids off at school, made dinner, and did her best to keep up appearances. But on the inside, she was drowning. She couldn't look at Mark without feeling a wave of disgust. She avoided him as much as she could, retreating into herself as the hurt consumed her. But the truth hung over her like a dark cloud, and every moment with him felt suffocating. Her heart burned with questions, but the answers eluded her. Why had he done this? Was it just an affair, or had there been something more going on behind the scenes? The uncertainty gnawed at her. She didn't confront Mark immediately. Part of her wasn't sure she was ready to hear the truth, whatever that truth might be. And part of her was terrified that if she confronted him, it would be the end of everything, the end of their marriage, the end of the family they had built. But at the same time, she couldn't keep living in this painful limbo, pretending everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. The more she tried to act normal, the more she became convinced that Mark was hiding something. Every time he left the house, every phone call or text he received, every little moment that felt off, added fuel to the fire of suspicion burning inside her. She started to investigate on her own. She went through his things when he wasn't home, his phone, his laptop, his briefcase, but found nothing concrete, only more confusion. Each time she thought she had uncovered a clue, it slipped through her fingers. But the fact that Mark was so secretive only deepened her belief that there was more going on than he was willing to admit. Susan's world began to feel like it was spinning out of control. She couldn't talk to anyone about it. How could she? Her friends wouldn't understand, and her family, who adored Mark, would never believe what she had seen. She felt isolated, alone in a storm of emotions that she couldn't escape. The silence between her and Mark grew more oppressive with each passing day. He acted as though nothing was wrong, as though they were still the same couple they had always been. He continued his routine, leaving early in the morning and coming home late. But the warmth that had once existed between them was gone. All she could see was the man who had betrayed her, the man who had allowed another woman into their lives in the most intimate way. The turning point came one night when Mark came home later than usual. Susan had been waiting up for him, sitting alone in the living room, her mind racing with all the questions she had been unable to ask. When he finally walked through the door, his face lit up in the way it always did when he was home after a long day. But to Susan, his smile seemed fake, an attempt to cover up something deeper. He kissed her on the cheek as he always did, but it felt distant, foreign. She couldn't ignore the icy wall that had gone up between them. That night, Susan made a decision. She would confront him, but not in the way she had originally planned. There would be no questions or attempts to understand. She had seen enough. She had felt enough. She was no longer willing to be the naive wife who didn't want to believe the truth. She was a woman who had been wronged, and she wanted to hear Mark's confession. As Mark settled in for the night, Susan stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The weight of the secret she was carrying pressed down on her chest, and the anger that had been simmering for days boiled over. She couldn't stand the thought of him lying to her any longer. She had been patient, but patience had only made the pain worse. With shaking hands, she walked into their bedroom and sat down across from him. She could feel her heart racing, but this time it wasn't because of love. It was because of betrayal, the kind that no one could undo. Mark looked at her in confusion, sensing the tension in the room. But Susan's eyes were hard. There was no more room for denial, no more pretending. She would get the truth, and she would get it now, even if it tore their lives apart. The storm that had been brewing for so long was finally ready to explode, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed Susan's decision to confront Mark were filled with an unsettling stillness. She had prepared herself mentally for what was to come, but when the time arrived, her heart raced with a combination of dread and anticipation. She knew that this conversation would change everything, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for the fallout. The pain of the affair still weighed heavily on her, and the thought of confronting Mark, of demanding answers, filled her with an overwhelming sense of unease. She couldn't pretend any longer, not for his sake, not for her children's sake, and not for her own. But even as she steeled herself for the confrontation, a small part of her clung to the hope that somehow Mark would come clean and take responsibility for his actions. When Mark returned home that evening, it was the same routine as always. He came in through the front door, smiling as if nothing was amiss, chatting briefly with the kids, and heading straight to the kitchen for a snack. He didn't notice Susan standing by the door, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for him to approach. As the evening went on, Susan tried to keep things as normal as possible. Small talk about the kids' activities, the weather, nothing out of the ordinary. But the tension between them was palpable, and Susan could feel it in every word, in every glance. It wasn't until after dinner, when they were sitting on the couch, that Susan knew the time had come. The house was quiet, the children tucked safely in bed, and there was no reason left to avoid the truth. She couldn't hold back any longer. As Mark scrolled through his phone, oblivious to her rising anger, Susan took a deep breath and turned to him. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of something darker, something desperate. Mark glanced up, his face neutral, as if this conversation was just another small inconvenience. He didn't know that. His world, their world, was about to come crashing down. "What about?" he asked casually, as though nothing was wrong. Susan clenched her fists at her sides, willing herself not to explode. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment that would define the rest of their lives. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing on her chest, and yet she knew she had no choice but to see it through. "I know about you and Sarah," she said, her voice cold, controlled, though her heart was breaking with every word she spoke. The silence that followed hung thick in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mark's face immediately lost its composure. His eyes flickered with panic before he quickly masked it with a forced, uneasy smile. "That's not what you think," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Susan's heart sank. She had expected denial, but hearing the words only made her feel more certain of the truth. She could feel her anger bubbling to the surface. "Don't lie to me, Mark. I saw you with her. I saw the way you were with her. Don't tell me it's not what I think." Mark opened his mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. He sat back, staring at her with a look of disbelief, as if trying to process how she had found out. There was no more denying it, though. The affair, the lies, all of it, had come to light. Susan had seen enough, and now she wanted answers, real answers. "I don't want to hear your excuses, Mark," Susan continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. "I want to know why. Why did you do this to me? Why did you lie to me all these months, all these years?" Her questions hung in the air like daggers, each one piercing through the facade he had carefully constructed. She felt a growing sense of betrayal, not just because of the affair, but because Mark hadn't even considered her feelings when he had gone behind her back. Mark's eyes softened, and for a moment Susan thought he might break down, might finally admit to everything. But instead he just looked away, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "It just happened," he muttered, as if the words could explain everything. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Susan couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You didn't mean for it to go this far," she repeated, her voice rising. "You think that makes it okay? You think that makes it better? Mark, you've ruined everything. You've ruined us." Mark opened his mouth again, but no words came out. He didn't know how to apologize, didn't know how to make it right. And Susan realized in that moment that he never truly understood the depth of the pain he had caused her. She wasn't just a wife betrayed. She was a woman who had given everything for a man who no longer valued her. And the realization was a bitter pill to swallow. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick with unspoken truths. Susan didn't know what she was expecting, but it certainly wasn't the hollow apology Mark offered. She had waited for a confession, for remorse, for some sign that he cared, truly cared, about what he had done. But all she got was more of the same empty words, hollow promises. Her heart, already shattered, broke a little more with each passing second. And in that moment, Susan knew she had to make a choice. She couldn't stay in this marriage, not with the man who had betrayed her so completely, the man who had chosen another woman over her, over their family, over everything they had built together. The truth was clear now, as painful as it was. The life she had known was gone, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the confrontation between Susan and Mark were filled with an eerie quiet that hung over the house like a thick fog. The weight of their argument, the raw truth that had been exposed, lingered in the air. Susan felt as though she were walking through a dream, one where nothing made sense anymore, yet she couldn't escape the harsh reality. Mark, despite his earlier attempts at explanation, had fallen silent. He no longer tried to justify himself, and every time Susan glanced at him, she saw nothing but a stranger sitting across from her. The man she had once known was gone, replaced by someone she could barely recognize. Mark kept his distance, retreating further into himself, as if hoping the problem would just fade away. But Susan couldn't ignore it. She couldn't pretend, any more that everything was fine. She couldn't go back to the way things had been. Her mind was consumed by the betrayal, and the hurt twisted inside her, gnawing at her constantly. It felt like a heavy, suffocating weight that never let up. It wasn't long before the tension in the house became unbearable. Their children, Emma and Jake, sensed the change in their parents. The once happy atmosphere had shifted to one of coldness and unease. They would ask questions, small things that children often did, like, "Why are you and Dad not talking?" or "When will we go back to the park again?" Susan didn't have the answers. She could only offer half-hearted explanations, not fully grasping how to explain the situation to them without damaging their innocence. But she couldn't ignore the sadness in their eyes, the confusion. She wasn't just falling apart. Her entire family was too. Susan spent most of her time away from Mark. She would go for walks alone, trying to clear her head, but the pain never left. It followed her like a shadow, reminding her that the man she had trusted, the man she had loved, was now the one who had shattered her world. She tried to reach out to friends, but she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone what had happened. How could she? How could she explain something so raw, so deeply painful? One evening, after another long and uncomfortable dinner where Mark said little and Susan barely spoke, something inside her snapped. The rage she had kept buried for so long surged to the surface. She couldn't take the silence anymore. She couldn't stand being in the same room as Mark without feeling the intense betrayal consuming her from the inside. She had tried to keep it together, to be the strong, patient wife who waited for things to get better, but there was no fixing this, no going back to what they had before. That night, as Mark came home later than usual, again, Susan made a decision. She had to end this. She couldn't live in this prison of anger and sorrow anymore. The words were burning in her throat, demanding to be spoken, demanding to be heard. She couldn't let Mark think everything was okay. Couldn't let him keep pretending that things could go back to normal. This wasn't just a rough patch. This wasn't something that could be patched up with an apology or a few kind gestures. It was too late for that. When Mark finally entered through the door, looking exhausted from another long day at the office, Susan was already waiting. The kids were asleep, the house eerily quiet. Mark was about to greet her as he always did, with a tired smile and a few words of casual conversation, but Susan didn't let him. She stopped him, standing in front of him, blocking the way. He seemed confused, perhaps even a little irritated, but Susan could feel the anger building inside her, filling the space between them. "I can't do this anymore," Susan said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't keep pretending that..." "We're okay. You've destroyed everything, Mark, everything we built. The lies, the betrayal, it's too much. I can't live like this anymore. I don't want to. Mark looked at her, his face a mixture of guilt and frustration. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words never came. It was as if he knew what she was going to say, as if he understood that she was no longer going to stand there, waiting for the man she once knew to return to her. "You don't get to do this to me, Mark," she continued, her voice stronger now. "You don't get to just come home like everything's fine, like we're still a family. Because we're not. We're not a family anymore." Mark took a step back, his eyes filled with a mix of shock and remorse. But Susan could see the desperation in his gaze. He knew in that moment that this wasn't just a disagreement. It was the end. Susan's mind was racing, and for the first time in a long time she felt clarity. She had been drowning for so long in uncertainty, in anger, in a relationship that had been slowly crumbling, but now she could breathe. It wasn't the relief she had hoped for, but it was something. She didn't have to be stuck in this painful limbo anymore. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough. This was the end of the road. "I want a divorce, Mark," she said, the words slipping out of her mouth like poison. "I'm done." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Susan didn't want to hear it. She turned away from him and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, alone in the silence they had both created. The sound of his footsteps as he followed her was all that remained. The days after Susan's decision to ask for a divorce were marked by a heavy, suffocating silence that filled the house. The tension that had been building between her and Mark was now fully exposed, and there was no going back. Susan had made her choice, but the aftermath wasn't as liberating as she had hoped. Instead, she found herself trapped in a whirlwind of mixed emotions: relief, anger, sadness, but most of all, fear. She was scared of what her life would look like now. Would she be able to navigate the future without the man she had once trusted? What would become of her children? The guilt of the pain her family would endure weighed heavily on her, even as she knew she couldn't stay in a marriage that had been shattered by betrayal. Mark, for his part, seemed to retreat further into himself. He didn't fight back against her decision, but neither did he make any efforts to save the marriage. There were no grand gestures, no pleading for forgiveness, no attempts to explain himself beyond the weak words he had offered her the night of the confrontation. The absence of any meaningful remorse only solidified Susan's belief that he wasn't the man she had married anymore. The Mark she had known had disappeared, replaced by someone who no longer had any desire to repair the damage he had caused. This truth hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. As the divorce proceedings began, Susan found herself overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. There was so much to consider. Custody arrangements for Emma and Jake, the division of assets, the looming question of whether she could afford to support herself and her children on her own. Despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing, Susan tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the sake of her children. They deserved stability, even if it was only an illusion. But the cracks in their family were becoming more and more apparent. Emma and Jake, who had once been carefree, happy children, now seemed quieter, more withdrawn. They didn't fully understand why their parents were no longer together, but they could sense the underlying tension. Susan hated that they had to witness the dissolution of their family, but there was no way to shield them from the reality of what had happened. In the midst of all this, Susan began to find solace in small things. She took long walks through the park, trying to reconnect with herself, with the woman she used to be before the betrayal. She reached out to friends who had been there for her in the past, leaning on their support as she faced the difficult road ahead. It wasn't easy. Some days, she felt utterly alone. The weight of her decision to end her marriage was a constant reminder of the pain she had endured. But over time, she started to feel a flicker of strength inside herself. For the first time in years, Susan realized that she was not defined by her marriage, not defined by Mark's actions. She was her own person, and she could rebuild her life piece by piece. But then, the unthinkable happened. One evening, after a particularly difficult day of legal meetings and stressful phone calls, Susan returned home to find a letter waiting for her. It was addressed to her, but the handwriting on the envelope was not Mark's. It was Sarah's. The woman who had torn their family apart had now found a way to reinsert herself into Susan's life. Susan's stomach churned as she tore open the envelope, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The letter was short, but its contents hit her like a punch to the gut. Sarah's words were laced with an arrogance that Susan found sickening. The letter apologized, but in a way that only seemed to blame Susan for the affair. Sarah claimed that Mark had been unhappy for years, that he had felt neglected, and that she had only been there for him when Susan couldn't understand him anymore. The letter concluded with a chilling statement. "You're better off without him. We're together now. It's time to move on." Susan sat there frozen. The words danced in front of her eyes, but none of them seemed real. Sarah's boldness, her audacity to claim a part of Susan's life, her family, was beyond comprehension. The anger that had been simmering in Susan for months suddenly erupted, a wave of fury washing over her. How dare she? How dare Sarah write to her as if she was the victim here, as if the destruction of her family was somehow justified? The rage that built up inside Susan was not just about Mark's betrayal. It was about the disrespect that had been heaped on her, the betrayal of not just her husband, but of the woman who had known better. Susan's hands gripped the letter, crumpling it in her fists as she stood up. In that moment, she realized that she couldn't let this woman, or Mark, control her life any longer. She had already taken the first step by demanding a divorce. Now, she needed to take the next one, to completely sever the ties that had bound her to them both. With newfound resolve, Susan picked up the phone and made the call that would officially end everything. She was done with them, done with the lies, the manipulation, and the pain they had caused. She would no longer be a passive victim in her own life. Mark had made his choices, and now Susan would make hers. It wasn't easy. The road ahead was still uncertain, and she knew the scars of this betrayal would linger for a long time. But as she hung up the phone, Susan felt a small sense of peace settle over her. It was the beginning of something new. She didn't know where it would take her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. And that, in itself, was enough to carry her forward.